Close your eyes for a moment. May 1991. Mountain Studios, Montreux. The alpine light is coming through the glass in long strips, falling across the floor of the vocal booth in pale angles. You are Freddie Mercury. You are 44 years old. You have been inside this studio for weeks, in and out, recording pieces of songs that do not yet have names or definite purposes. Filling the time the way a man fills time when the alternative is to sit still and think about what is coming. Your hands shake sometimes now. Your body does things you do not ask it to do. But your voice is still yours. That is the thing no one fully understands from the outside. Watching the body diminish and the face grow thin, the voice was the last thing to go. You walk to the microphone. The track is rolling. Brian May is watching from the glass. You open your mouth. You sing the first verse of Mother Love, then the second, then the third. Then you stop. You look at the sheet in your hand. The last verse is there, written in your own handwriting, the words you chose because no other words would do. You know them. You know every word. You say, "I'll come back and finish it next time." Now open your eyes. There was no next time. Mother Love was not a single. It was not built for radio, not designed to be the song that plays at the end of a film while the credits roll and the audience reaches for their things. It was not a Queen anthem in the way Bohemian Rhapsody is an anthem, built in layers and sections and designed to be experienced as an event. It was not the way We Will Rock You is a chant that belongs to stadiums and football grounds and places where thousands of people discover they can become one sound. Mother Love was something quieter and therefore something more difficult to look at directly. It was a man asking, near the end of his life, to be held, to be taken somewhere safe, to be returned to a place before the illness, before the treatments, before the daily negotiation with a body that no longer cooperated, to be returned to a place that might never have existed, the place a child imagines when it cries and waits for someone to come. Brian May wrote the music. Freddie Mercury wrote the words. Neither of them, in May 1991, said out loud what the words were about. They did not need to. The Innuendo album had been finished and released in February 1991. It had debuted at #1 in the United Kingdom. The band had worked through 1990 and into 1991 in a state of deliberate motion, not because they did not know what was coming, but because stopping would have meant acknowledging it in a way that none of them were prepared to do. Freddie had told them his diagnosis in 1990. He had called them in and he had said it plainly, and they had not fallen apart in the room, because that was not what he needed them to do. He had asked them not to talk about it publicly, not to confirm or deny when the press asked, which the press was beginning to do with increasing directness. He had said, "I don't want anything to change. Get on with business as usual." And so they did. They got on with it. They recorded. They arranged. They appeared in music videos, Freddie, in increasingly layered clothing, increasingly static in the frame, the camera angles doing the work that his body was no longer able to do. The public saw it. Journalists wrote about it. Some of them said it out loud in print. And still the band said nothing. They protected him the way people protect the things they cannot afford to lose, by refusing, for as long as possible, to name the loss. What no one tells you about the sessions in early 1991 is this. Freddie Mercury was not simply enduring them. He was running toward them. Every morning that he could stand, every day that the pain was manageable and the body was cooperating to some minimum degree, he was in the studio. Not because he had no choice, because it was the only place where none of this was happening to him. By May 1991, the band was working on material that did not have a clear destination. This was not the follow-up to Innuendo, it was something looser, something that existed because the alternative to being in the studio was not being in the studio, and that alternative had become unacceptable. Brian May had brought in the music for what would become Mother Love. It was built around a gentle, rolling progression. something that moved forward without urgency, something that could hold words rather than drive them. Freddie heard it and said he had words. The words were about a child who is lost and frightened and crying in the dark, calling for its mother. About a man who has wandered too far from safety and wants to be carried home. About love understood not as passion or conquest or the blaze of early desire, but as the specific kind of shelter that is there before everything else and will be there after everything else has ended. Brian May would say later that when Freddie sang it, there was no separation between the man and what he was singing. The two things were the same thing. There was only one presence in the room. The sessions at Mountain Studios were conducted without announcement or press access. No journalists were invited. No statements were made about what was being recorded or why. Montreux had always occupied a particular place in the geography of Freddie Mercury's life, the city on the lake, the studio carved into the hillside above the water. The distance from London, and from what London required of him. He had an apartment in Montreux. He had built a life there that ran parallel to his London life. Quieter, less scrutinized, composed of neighbors who greeted him at the market and did not ask for photographs. He walked in the mornings along the lake when the light was still soft and the water held the mountains upside down in its surface. Those walks had become shorter over the course of 1991. The distance between where he was able to go and where he was unable to go had been contracting for months. But he still walked. And he still went to the studio. And in May 1991, he went to the microphone and sang. On the day they recorded Mother Love, Freddie Mercury sang 3 of the 4 verses. Brian May was at the board. Roger Taylor was there. The room had the specific quality of people who are paying very close attention without allowing the person they are watching to feel watched. They had developed this skill over 30 years of friendship, over decades of being in rooms together where some kind of management of the situation was required, where the balance between supporting and crowding had to be maintained with precision. Freddie did not want to be observed in his weakness. He wanted to be heard in his power. And for the first 3 verses, he was. Whatever the body was doing outside the microphone, whatever was happening to his hands and his weight and his ability to walk across a room without effort inside the vocal booth, in May 1991, the voice that came through was the voice that had stood at Wembley in July 1985 and held 72,000 people in complete silence simply by holding a note. That voice was still there. In the booth, in Montreux, in the spring before the last autumn, it was entirely itself. Then he reached the last verse. The words were there on the sheet, words he had written, words about wanting to go home. And he stopped. He did not stop because the voice failed. He stopped before the voice had the chance to. He put the lyric sheet down and he said, "I'll come back and finish it next time." Brian May said nothing. Roger Taylor said nothing. Freddie Mercury walked out of the vocal booth. There are 2 ways to hear that sentence. The first is the simpler one. A man who was tired, who needed to rest, who fully intended to return the following week and stand at the same microphone and complete the verse and move on to the next thing. This interpretation is not wrong. It is possible. The second interpretation is darker and more precise. A man who knew exactly what those words meant, who had written them out of something true and immediate, who stood at the microphone and looked at the last verse of a song about wanting to be carried home by love, and understood in that moment that he could not yet sing it. Not could not, in terms of the voice, could not in terms of what it would mean to sing those words in that room with those people watching through the glass. To sing the last verse of Mother Love in May 1991 would have been to say something that Freddie Mercury was not ready to say out loud. Brian May has spoken about this recording session in interviews over many years since. Each time, he speaks with deliberate care. He chooses his words the way a man chooses words when he is trying to be both honest and protective at the same time. He has never said which interpretation is correct. He may not know. He may know precisely, and have decided that it is not his to say. Freddie Mercury left Mountain Studios in the late spring of 1991 and returned to Garden Lodge in Kensington. He did not go back to Montreux to finish the verse. June came, and there was no return. July came, and there was no return. August came. The summer was very warm in London that year. The garden at Garden Lodge was in full flower. On the 28th of August, someone took a photograph of Freddie Mercury standing in the garden. He is wearing a loose shirt. He is standing in the light in a way that suggests he has stepped outside for a moment and will step back in shortly. He does not look like a man who is about to become a permanent absence from all photographs. He looks like a man standing in his garden on a warm August day. That photograph is the last known image of Freddie Mercury while he was alive. The last verse of Mother Love was still unfinished when it was taken. It remained unfinished for the rest of his life, which ended 3 months later. On the 24th of November, 1991, Brian May made a decision in the years after Freddie's death. The decision was that Mother Love should exist as a complete recording, that the song should not be released with a silence where the last verse should be, should not be offered to the world as a document of what was not finished. He would sing the last verse himself. He did not announce this decision publicly. He went into the studio and he stood at a microphone and he sang the words that Freddie Mercury had written and had been unable or unwilling or not yet ready to sing. The distance between those three descriptions, unable, unwilling, not yet ready, is the distance inside which the entire meaning of that May 1991 session lives. Brian May's voice is not Freddie Mercury's voice. No voice anywhere on earth is Freddie Mercury's voice. But the verse existed now, inside a recording, and the song could be given to the album, and the album could be completed. And people who had loved that voice for 30 years could hear what had been written in that room in Montreux before the summer. Made in Heaven was released in November 1995, 4 years after the session. 4 years after Freddie Mercury put down a lyric sheet and said next time and walked out of the booth and back into the light, Made in Heaven ends with Mother Love. It is the last track on the last album. Brian May has said that placing it there was not accidental. The album ends where Freddie ended mid-sentence, mid-breath, the voice giving way to another voice, which is itself a kind of ending. The last thing you hear on the last Queen album is a man asking, in someone else's voice, to be held. What the unfinished verse means depends entirely on what you bring to it. If you believe Freddie Mercury stopped because he was simply tired that day, because he needed rest, because the intention was always to return and complete the work, then the blank space at the bottom of that lyric sheet is a practical absence, an administrative gap, a session that was not finished for logistical reasons and would have been completed under other circumstances. Nothing more. If you believe the other thing, if you believe that a man dying of AIDS stood at a microphone in May 1991 with words in front of him about wanting to be carried home to safety, and understood that he could not yet say those words out loud, that to sing them would be to cross a threshold he was not prepared to cross, inside a room with people he loved, in a moment that would be recorded and exist permanently, then the absence is not logistical at all. It is the most accurate thing he ever left on tape. The silence where the fourth verse should be is not a failure to finish. It is a record of the exact boundary of what he could give and the specific shape of what he held back. That boundary, that shape, is its own kind of truth. It does not need a voice to be heard. Brian May sang the last verse. The song exists in its complete form. The album ends with it. You can hear all 4 verses now, if you want to. You can hear the words Freddie Mercury wrote and the melody he chose, and the voice that carried the first 3 verses, and then you can hear the 4th, in a different voice, placed there by someone who understood what it cost to put it there. But in May 1991, in a recording studio above a lake in the Swiss Alps, Freddie Mercury put down a handwritten sheet of paper and said next time, and walked out through the door and did not come back. The verse he left blank is still blank in some version of that room, the version that exists only in the people who were standing at the glass when he left. Brian May was at the glass. Roger Taylor was at the glass. They watched him walk out. They said nothing. They stayed where they were. Some things that are left unfinished are not unfinished. They are finished exactly where they stopped, at the precise point where going further would have meant becoming something other than true.